The Holy Gospel according to John, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him,
She knelt at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Judeans who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid him? They said, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Judeans said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind person have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, Lord, already there is a stench because he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus said, Did I not tell you, if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they might believe that you sent me. When Jesus had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. There is no time for hand-wringing in a world somehow simultaneously burning, flooding, dying, and growing out of balance. Death is making its presence known in every corner of the globe, and we must powerfully proclaim and daily live out the good news that death's hold on us has been broken. Those aren't my words. That was the mic drop of Dr. Marvin Wickware, preached boldly and powerfully last week as we gathered in this chapel to mark the celebration of Reformation Day. I have been carrying those words in my spirit since last week, and the disorientation I felt in them in a world that is all those things at one time. Knowing that we would gather here again a week later to mark another significant day in the church year as we celebrate All Saints' Day, a day when we drape the worship space in the colors of our most sacred resurrection days, when we remember the grief for this burning, flooding, dying, and growing world is very much real. When we say again and again the powerful sentiment of Dr. Wickware's sermon, that even in the midst of death that is so real, the hold death has on us is no more. I think pastoral caregivers and pastoral theologians like myself are often called to preach on All Saints' Day, because this is a day where grief and all the feelings that come with it are very much present. We are the ones who are supposed to be the experts in holding space for all those feelings, in knowing which way is up when we feel flooded with emotions and memories. I have a pretty rich archive, I'll say, of my own sermons about this day. But as I read over them, in thinking about what I had to say about this day and this text every other time I've preached on it, I have to say that this year, I find this day and these texts profoundly disorienting. In the past, like many other preachers, I have spoken kindly about the people in our community that we have loved who have died. And I've even teared up as I remembered all those saints that surround all of us as we do the work of living in a broken and beautiful world. It is a day We're talking plainly about death and the power of death. But this year, I honestly don't know how to speak plainly about death not having a hold on us anymore, when the power of death is so ever present that I don't have an idea of how to hold in my mind the sheer expanse of our cultural grief. How do we think about the power of death on this day, when as of yesterday, more than 5 million people worldwide have died of COVID-19? How do we think about the power of death when in our own country, almost 800,000 people are gone, more than 1,100 of them yesterday? How do we think about what it means to say death has no hold on us when over and over again I have heard, along with you, people in our culture talk about the death of real, living, and loving people as if, well, what could we do? They were old, or they had a pre-existing condition, or they're in the developing world, or they're not white. I don't know how to talk about the power of death when we have all felt the entire world economy and infrastructure nearly grind to a halt when we realized that there is a virus we've never seen before. So I'm holding the expanse of this grief that has moved beyond the ability for my mind to comprehend as I come to the gospel text for this day, and I find myself just as disoriented. In pastoral care and counseling, we often talk about who is in the room of care and how we figure out where our care ought to focus. When you run into a hospital room and everyone is vibrating with their own pain and fear, as skilled caregivers, we assess, even unconsciously, who is the one that needs care here and who needs care first. But when the situation is overwhelming, when the story of pain and anguish is too great, even the most skilled caregivers among us can get tripped up, lost in the sheer volume of the feelings. If we were together to get lost in this passage from John's Gospel, I think what we would first notice is Mary, one of a pair of sisters who, before our passage for today, sent a message to Jesus to tell him that the one he loves, Lazarus, is sick. And yet Jesus doesn't leave Bethany. He stays for 2 more days until he just tells the disciples to pack up and it's time to head to Judea. And so we first encounter Mary running to Jesus. She runs and kneels before Jesus and she says to him, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." I can imagine her weeping as she says these words to Jesus, the one she and her sister have waited for. I can imagine that she stared at the feet of the man she knew could perform miracles, and she spoke to him in great anger. If you had been here, if you hadn't abandoned us in our hour of need, if you had loved him, you would have come. But you didn't, and now Lazarus is dead. We can hear the hopelessness and the edge of that anger. According to Jewish tradition, the soul stayed with the body for 3 days and then departed. Lazarus has been dead for 4. 4 days, and so now not even a miracle is possible. Their brother has died and there's no way to bring him back. And now we encounter in the passage Jesus, also deeply moved in his spirit at the sight of all these people wailing and crying, perhaps at the anger that radiated off Mary. And in mere moments, Jesus will weep too. But we have to pause for just a second, because if we look closely, this deeply moved Jesus isn't just feeling the grief and sadness, the loss and the pain. The Greek suggests that being deeply moved in spirit is more like he was angered, enraged even. Some scholars suggest he was angry that no one believed he was about to do a miracle. Or perhaps that all these people didn't know how to focus on the right thing. But I wonder if in the face of all that seeks to kill and destroy us, perhaps we need space for a God who knows our anger too. For a God that recognizes at the graves of 5 million people, we don't just need our sadness. We need the profound, burning energy of our anger. We don't need a God that can only weep with us. We need a God that is willing to hold our anger too, to overturn tables and vaccine hoarding, to know that there is space for anger when death arrives too soon. The second sister is there too, the practical one. And our focus might fall there for just a moment as Jesus comes to the opening of the tomb and commands them to roll away the stone. And Martha, the one we remember was preparing food in the kitchen while Mary sat and learned at the teacher's feet, reminds Jesus that if he does that, if he opens the tomb, it's going to smell. There is going to be the reality of death without just the anger and the crying. There's going to be the practical parts of death, and maybe Martha wants to save us from having to smell that, from having to know in their bodies that Lazarus, beloved Lazarus, decomposes in his tomb like everyone else, that maybe he deserves some dignity in his death, not to be remembered with the stink of rot. Perhaps the numbers of people who have died in these last 18 months, numbers beyond our comprehension, Jesus says they deserve dignity too, deserve their names read, deserve not to just be a notch on a graph, part of a numbers game that helps us to know how to balance risk versus economic standstill. These people are real people, not just ideas. And when we stop, when the power of death arrives, how easy it is to find ourselves with our lists and our plans and our practicalities, because to comprehend that feeling of loss is too much. And someone needs to be a person who's just going to be logical. This already feels to me like enough happening. 2 sisters and Jesus all giving us a lens into this passage, but yet there is still more going on in the scene. Because in the tomb called out of death and into life is Lazarus. Called out of the tomb of death with grave clothes still wrapping his body and covering his face. This isn't some sort of bright, magical superhero story. This is a second chance at life. This is another life, but one that is still wrapped in the trappings of death. And it is here, as Lazarus is likely blinking his eyes against the bright sun, maybe even wondering to himself, what in the world has just happened? That Jesus commands that weeping crowd too, that they need to come here and unbind the man that once was dead and who is now alive. Even the miracle that is now needs a community to surround Lazarus in this new life, to tenderly remove the bandages from his face and let him breathe the fresh air. What we don't know yet is that even as they unbind him, this scene is so disorienting. The life that has burst forth from the tomb of death is so frightening that some begin to wonder if there's actually more safety in death and destruction. If the dead ought to just stay dead. And the way to get back to a world that makes sense is to destroy both Jesus and Lazarus. The power of life over death is probably the most disorienting of all, especially when it calls us to do something differently, to live differently, to give up the ways with which we have grown comfortable, and to join in this project of trusting that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Our text is disorienting. Our lives in 2021 are disorienting because death is disorienting. in a world where at some level we know that all of us will die. COVID-19 has brought into stark relief the false promise of hyper-individualism to defeat death. We cannot survive alone. And so in this disorientation, when everyone sees the tragedy in a different way, when we don't know where to turn our attention or who is in need of most care, it is the promise of this story echoed in the celebration of All Saints that commands us to focus. Because if you're angry, if you are lost, if you don't know how to feel and only how to do, if you are lost in a tomb that was made for you or one that you carved with your own hands, if the ever-present reality of death in these days causes you to lose your sense of where we are in the world of our own stories, if you want to destroy whatever you can because there is nowhere else to put your fear, I can tell you this: wherever there is death, wherever the world is burning, wherever it feels as if there is no hope, the promise of our gospel is that with tears on his face and anger in his spirit, our God says to the power of death, no more. No more will this be the last word. No more are we alone. No more are we abandoned, lost, because we have been grafted into the story of our God, one that is founded and forged in life. One that says, even when we believe it's all over, the vision of new life is always possible. Hope cannot die, and that resurrection life is our promise. So, church, hear me when I say, this promise is not only for those who are in the grave. This promise that we have been freed into new life, that the chains of death have been broken, so that right now, in this moment, we can live to serve a world that is in desperate need of the power of a resurrection life. This promise is for you. Disoriented, confused, angry, and afraid, this promise is for you. Resurrection is not out there, it is a right now reality. We are freed to live into this good news, to trust that this is the handhold when everything feels like too much to comprehend. You are called out by God, called out of the tombs of this life, freed to serve our neighbors, freed to defy the power of death that tells us we are all alone and that everything that is precious is scarce. This is your good news. You are freed to live into and to create with God a kind of life in another kind of world. Amen.